Okay, good evening, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay in start with the microphone, but I'm really delighted to see you all here this evening. I'm René Korbar, I'm Dean of Lifelong Learning and Professional Practice here at Newcastle University and one of the professors in the School of Education. I'm delighted to see you all here at this evening, which is part of our series of Newcastle debates, inspired by the government's 5 missions. Firstly, some housekeeping. Please can we ask you to all put your phones on silent. Secondly, if there's no fire alarm planned, so if we hear the fire alarm, can we please follow one of our event stewards outside to the car park. The theme of today is opportunities for all. How can we improve access to education and employment in the Northeast? Allow me to start with a few introductory remarks. The Labour Party has promised to reform the education system and break down barriers to opportunity. The government commissioned a curriculum and assessment review panel, whose initial findings were published yesterday, confirmed it's going to be an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary approach to curriculum reform. Meanwhile, reports indicate that a third of all children and young people in the Northeast are living in poverty. Tonight's debate is also very topical, as the Education Select Committee has just closed its submissions for the inquiry on skills and further education. And let's move to more local policy terms. The Northeast Combined Authority is currently consulting on its draft employability and skills policy. And priority 2 links really nicely to today's event, and that is it sets out an ambition for all of our young people to have the skills, confidence, and aspiration to progress into jobs and fulfilling working lives. So today's debate is set within a policy context that is lively debated, and I'm delighted that we've got 4 figures from the region and beyond to join us to debate this for the next hour and a half. We've got pre-submitted questions. We'll be using them fairly quickly at the beginning. We will then move to audience participation, may return to the pre-submitted questions. One of our speakers, Dame Irene Hayes, will have to leave at 7 o'clock, but can then carry on. But we wanted to give the audience the opportunity to also interrogate Irene if you feel so. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel, and please welcome the panel together with me. We've got Dame Irene Hayes. Thank you. Chris Zarraga, Lesley Powell, CBE, and Nick Harrison. And we've asked the panel to give a short 2-minute introduction, about themselves, but also really setting the tone of their priorities and their kind of passion to that topic. Over to you, Irene.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Irene. I'm the owner and chair of Hayes Travel, and for the last 44 years have been involved in different iterations of apprenticeship schemes, starting with the YTS. Give me a nod if you all remember the lovely YTS. And prior to acquiring Thomas Cook in 2019, we primarily based our apprenticeships in the Northeast and endeavoured to attract as many young people as possible from deprived neighbourhoods. Last year I employed 630 apprentices and 38 graduates. The business has been built on young people and the belief that young people do not necessarily need formal qualifications to lead a happy and fulfilled life and have a successful career.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name's Chris Zarraga. Director of Schools North East. For those of you who don't know what Schools North East is, we're a registered charity and a network of all 1,150 schools in the North East of England. We also run something called the National Network of Special Schools, which is about another 400 schools in specialist settings, hospital settings, etc., across England. So there's about 1,600 schools in the network. We were set up to try and give North East schools a strategic voice in the education debate. If you'll pardon the pun, to try and put a regional accent on the educational debate, because the debate tends to take place in the south of England, in Westminster, in London, and they come up with all kinds of bright ideas, which when you translate them to the context of the North East, you get all kinds of unforeseen consequences, and usually the consequences aren't successful consequences. I wouldn't mind if they were, but they're usually not successful. I'm really looking forward to this because obviously I'm going to get to sit on a panel and to learn from the people on the panel and from the members in the audience. So it's great to be sat here, and thank you for the opportunity to sit with one of Britain's foremost businesswomen, an organisation of the size and the repute of the Sutton Trust, but also with a school leader like Lesley Powell, because I think it's worth making this point. I will make this point throughout the evening and the different parts around education. But Lesley's one of the outstanding school leaders of her generation, and that's not unusual in the North East. And I don't say that lightly, and I'm not saying that to put Lesley up, but that's a fact. So you might not get many answers from me, but hopefully I'll learn something tonight and take that away. I'm really disappointed as well to be here tonight for two reasons. One, it's my son's 13th birthday, and I forgot when I booked this in. So I've been getting quite a bit of stick for this for some time now. And secondly, because I'm not a teacher, I'm not an ex-teacher. I was private sector, took a career break and started to work with schools in about 2004 on a project that was across the North East region. It was funded by the Treasury. Ironically, it was all around enterprise education, work-related learning, how you get young people to maximise their life chances and get the career opportunities that they deserve. How you integrate business with schools, how they work more closely together, etc., etc. So that's the really disappointing thing, because I've been talking about this for at least 21 years, and I know people who've been doing it for 30, 40 and longer years, and it's the same debate, the same issues, the same problems. And as Rennie said, Labour's promised to reform the education system. Please stop. It would be nice to not have continuous reform within the system, without looking at kind of what works. And got a few principles that sort of come out through my contribution tonight, the first of which is to stop tinkering with things. Education policy, whether it's higher, further education, schools, primary, whatever, it's just one policy initiative after another, and then it changes with 6 months when there's a new Secretary of State for Education, and then if there's a new Secretary of State, because you have a change of government, then everything goes out the window, and they start more change, more policy, etc., etc. We need to stop tinkering and look at some of the underlying issues, and to be honest, be quite revolutionary about it. I think a period of stability followed by some revolution on some of the key issues would be far better than this kind of constant churn, which is just so draining for teachers, for all staff within schools, but particularly our school leaders, and we see that in the retention figures. I also think we need to admit that there are certain things that locally we can't influence, and I'm a great believer in a certain amount of autonomy for the people who are at the chalk face, the coal face, in the trenches, whatever you want to call it. But for instance, if you look at high quality jobs and how do we encourage more within the North East, as long as energy costs in the UK are 4 times higher than their nearest rivals, we're really going to struggle to attract those big businesses to the North East in the numbers that we want. And in the North East, we can't do much about that. The cost of energy, we're on the receiving end of that with the cost of living crisis, rather than being able to impact on that. I think many of the problems that we see when we look at sort of young people who are just from the GCSEs, who are going into further education or higher education or into employment or not into employment, from an educational point of view, you can literally predict what's going to happen to them at about age 5. And if you don't start to work on these problems by age 2, then literally you may as well just forget. And I don't mean that. We shouldn't forget. But what I mean is that the system, and I don't mean individual schools or trusts, some of them can do amazing jobs and book the odds, but the system across the whole country will largely fail to do what we want it to do. We need to start early. We need to focus on certain golden threads instead of piddling money away in tiny little batches on a million different things that have no impact on the overall problems. We expect schools to solve everything: relationships, knife crime, family breakdown, drugs, climate change, you name it, as well as actually teach English and maths and the things that they're measured on. But we need to stop piddling money away in small packets, look at some of the key issues and absolutely focus on them over the long term, and essentially nuke them rather than just kind of warm them up a little bit and hope that they go away. And then lastly, and I'll shut up and I'll pass on to Lesley, we have a critical need for competent government that understands the role the government should play, rather than be in a position where, and we've had plenty of this over the last 20 years, where Secretaries of States are trying to micromanage an individual teacher in an individual classroom. It's just absolutely absurd. They need to understand their role, how they can identify the big picture goals that we need to work towards, and then how they can facilitate the people at the chalk face to meet those goals as efficiently, as effectively as possible. So I'll shut up now and pass on to Lesley.
Well, firstly, thank you for those really very kind words, Chris. That was really generous. Thank you. My name is Lesley Powell. I've been a teacher for 37 years, and I still consider myself a teacher, even though I am the CEO of North East Learning Trust. I'm in schools pretty much every day, working with staff and children sometimes still. And that's important to me, and I taught in the classroom for the first 27 years of my career, so I do feel I've got a somewhat lifetime spent, if you like, in the education system, a range of experiences. North East Learning Trust, we have 16 schools under our umbrella, 9 secondaries, 7 primaries, the vast majority white, British, working class, top quintile deprivation, and all that goes with that. We also co-sponsor a 14 to 16 SEMH school. We're also really proud of our sort of system-wide role. So we have a research school, we have a teacher training arm, we are a teaching school hub, and we have an attendance hub. And that means we do a lot of work across the region and actually beyond the region, supporting trusts, sometimes schools and other organisations. And like Chris, I do often take the opportunity, and I've had lots of opportunities, fortunately, to be a voice for the North East and some of the bodies in London. It is very Southern centric. They don't always understand the context. But I'm also really keen that the context doesn't define us. My absolute passion is equality of opportunity and equality of expectation for children. Our children here are as good as any child anywhere. The children in the most deprived school in my trust are as good as any child anywhere. And I absolutely see that as my job, to make sure that those barriers, those hurdles that those children face are removed as best as we can, so that they get the chance to fulfill their potential and move their family and their lives forward in the way that they want to do, so that they can fulfill their desires. And sometimes we have to be ambitious for them, where we teach them to be ambitious for themselves, but that is our job, and that's what we are absolutely driven by in everyday work that we do in all of our schools. So that's my passion for school. Like Chris, it would be really nice to have some stability, shall we say, but stability that is going to be positive and functional and going to help us to move those sort of aims and objectives forward.
Thank you, Lesley. And over to you, Nick.
Yeah, look, thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah, in terms of my story first, I suppose I live in London now, but I grew up down the road in Chesterley Street. Actually, you were saying you were at my old school today.
This morning.
Now part of your trust. And I'm someone who's benefited from opportunity. So I was lucky enough to be I was the first kid ever in my school to go to Oxbridge. So I went off to Cambridge. I did physics. I stayed on for a PhD. I then somehow found my way into business consulting after that, and worked in London and around the world in that job for almost 20 years. I then did what I always call my midlife crisis job in the fashion industry for a few years. You maybe wouldn't think that to look at me, but and now I'm running the Sutton Trust, And we're a national charity which is focused on social mobility, as we call it, or opportunity for kids from low income backgrounds. And our work, we work nationwide, and our work is there's two things we do essentially. We work directly with young people, mainly in sixth form stage, and we work with about 10,000 young people each year on sort of access to university and access to career programs essentially. So we help disadvantaged young people get into great universities and into great jobs. And then we also do research and advocacy, and we look from what we call from birth to the workplace. So we look at early years, nursery education, primary school, secondary school, into university apprenticeships, and then into the jobs market. And the research, we're essentially identifying barriers to opportunity and then looking at solutions to those barriers. And then we use that research in policy advocacy with government, but also in change programs with like business sectors and universities and others. So like, for example, last week, we kicked off a change program with the tech sector at Google at King's Cross in London on that. So that's kind of what we do. I mean, my passion for the topic is similar to yours, really. It's opportunity for everybody. And, it's worth just before we zoom back into the Northeast, it's worth going macro for a second. And the UK is very bad at opportunity for everybody. So when you look at the stats across the developed world, we are the second worst behind America. So in the UK, your background very strongly determines your outcomes today. So we need to recognize we're bad, and we also need to recognize it has not improved in the last 25 years. So the UK is in a sort of bad spot here. And while we welcome the government's ambition in the opportunity mission, which I think was the sort of the framing for this discussion, there's a lot of work that needs doing behind that to make substantive change, which will actually shift the needle. And the Northeast, I always look at the Northeast because I'm from here. Whenever we get national stats, I always sort of zoom in and take a look. It is a bit of a microcosm of some of the things that need changing. We obviously have some challenges in the area. We have high levels of deprivation and poverty and child poverty, I think, as you said at the start. You can see that feeding through to the attainment and the attainment gap in schools. It's not to say the schools are doing a bad job, but they're dealing in a very tough circumstance. There's relatively low progression rates to university from the area compared to other areas, and obviously the employment prospects and economic value add per worker again are low in the Northeast compared to other areas. So there's lots of stuff that needs fixing, I suppose. And my interest in this debate tonight, I think, is some sort of big challenges, but what are the big solutions we can bring to the table to make change? And I always say like the Northeast was the epicenter of the world economy 150 years ago. Question is, what do we need to change to get us back to there in the next 150 years? And so I think that for me is perhaps some of the interesting bits of the debate we can get into tonight.
Thank you so much, Nick. And it was such a nice segue into the first pre-submitted question that we've got. Yeah. And that is, the number of young people classed as not in education, employment or training is increasing consistently. What practical measures should be taken to better prepare young adults for the world of work? Irene, do you want to respond first?
Yeah, okay. So I think that I'm not an educational professional, but I did chair the Education and Skills Funding Agency for a while when I was on the board of the Department for Education, and it was apparent that if you were to make predictions about the outcomes for young people, you could pretty much predict by the time they were aged 12, 13, 14, where it would be that their future would lie. And yet the education system persists, particularly with those young people who, for one reason or another, are particularly disadvantaged, in educating them within a fairly rigid curriculum right up until the age of 16 or sometimes 17. My strong preference would be to expose young people from the age of 14 into the world of work so that they can begin to understand what it takes to be a fully functioning contributor to employment and be a good member of a team. It would also give them the opportunity to see that, particularly in our instance, where we're working with the City of Sunderland College, to take 14-year-olds out for part of their week into an employment environment, that it's actually okay to smile at people. They can actually have social interaction with each other, and they can leave their mobile phones alone for 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon, because that's what they're required to do. Now, they may seem to be pretty basic attributes. I think the more opportunities we create for young people to be out of the education environment, if it's highly unlikely that they are likely to want to go on to further education, the better it will be for all concerned, but most importantly for those young people, to give them an earlier opportunity to succeed than they otherwise would have had.
Thank you. Can I just follow this up in the sense of, you clearly have achieved that. I've recently been in a conversation where some people have told me that in the construction industry they tried this, but actually the red tape and the health and safety requirements are so high that they actually don't want to engage with 14, 16, 17-year-olds. They really look at 18-year-olds. Is there an issue around the kind of red tape?
Yeah, the red tape has been primarily around schools not wanting to lose pupil premium, and it's really important that the system works holistically in order that those schools who do allow their pupils to go and do vocational training from the age of 14 are not punished financially. But then there needs to be a benefit for the educational establishment who have a duty to continue with the curriculum work that those young people would need. But it needs a coalition of the willing to actually achieve all of that, and it needs give and take between further education institutions and schools and head teachers. And as with most things in life, it always comes down to the people. And if the people at the top see that there is an issue here where they perhaps can find a solution, they will do that. But we're a long, long way from a whole system approach to making things better for young people.
Lesley, would you like to pick up on that?
I think it's actually quite a bit wider than just preparing them for work. I think with the number of children who are currently heading into the elective home education sphere at the moment, which is catastrophic, without question, it's catastrophic. And because I'm on the ground, I'm seeing some of the decision making around that and how hard we're trying to persuade parents not to do that, and some of the drivers around that. I think we're heading into really troubled waters, and I think this is a picture that's going to get worse, not better. So I think it's wider than even just for the world of work. It's ability to operate and function in the adult world,
I agree
almost.
with that,
Social interaction, ability to tolerate disappointment, to tolerate not getting your own way in some cases, literally. It can be as tiny as that, some of the reasoning. I think we have a massive post-COVID societal change in attitudes to school and schooling and the contract, but as always, it is probably our most disadvantaged children who are actually at the sharp end of this. So there's some really catastrophic numbers in elective home education that are worrying me terribly, and I know in the schools bill the government are addressing some of that with regards to children who are at risk in terms of child protection. But that's only a really small proportion of the children who are currently. I do have a theory that in about 6 months' time, parents will maybe be sick of having their children at home all of the time and think it's probably best to send them back to school. I do have a bit of a theory around that. We will see. It's not happening much at the moment. But I am really, really, really concerned about that, and I think it only exacerbates the issues that Irene's talking about. And in terms of letting children out of school, I think it's not just around money, Irene, it's around the regulatory framework in which we are governed. It's about all that goes with that. It's a really difficult decision. So we have children who obviously they want to go to the football clubs and various things like that. It's really hard for us to manage because there's a lot of regulation about how we have to manage the delivery of a coherent curriculum to children. And if they are part-time out of the school, it is meant to be integrated within the school curriculum so that it is a coherent whole. And we have to justify that when we are inspected and things like that as well, even at an individual child level. And then the really big question, there's something about resilience. And I think particularly post-COVID, there is something about resilience. We're giving really mixed messages to our children. We're given really mixed messages. We'll have an exam system that's a feat of endurance. We certainly need resilience for that. And then we'll have another system that's saying actually the inclusion agenda is no matter what, you must stay here and do that. And we're almost yin and yang in the messages that we're giving children. And I think disappointment, not getting elected to that position, not winning that competition, some of that. Some children have become unable to manage that at all. And that's really unhealthy for them as they go into adulthood, because the easiest way to not be disappointed is to not try and to not engage. And so I have real serious concerns at the moment about this swathe of children at the moment who are electively home educated, I think NEETs is going to become a much more troublesome issue soon. Because these children are not equipped, and they're not going to be equipped. It's 16 or 18 to access what I think we're going to have to come up with whole new routes for young people who have missed out on years of schooling at a certain phase of their career, and then we're going to have to try and get them back. And I think the FE colleges, as always, do a fantastic job at picking up those perhaps who've not lived a linear life, as I call it, that haven't quite had things quite as straightforward. But I think we're going to have to do some really deep thinking about how we re-engage these children and young people in the world of adults and normal living, rather than just in the world of work. Thank you, Lesley. And I think Nick, you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, it's a massive question, right? But I think you have to say, so why have NEETs gone up? So my hypothesis is, I think there's a bit of a perfect storm at the moment of you've got more challenge coming through the system with young people from cost of living crisis and COVID. You've got school budgets which are squeezed, which means there's fewer resources to deal with that challenge that's coming through the system. And then outside in the outside world, you've got a tough business environment, and so the sort of opportunities from employers is getting squeezed as well, arguably. So you look at that and you sort of say, how the hell do you unpick that? And ultimately, I sort of say, I think you need more resources in school to sort of unpick those challenges with the young people and try and coax them back to operating normally, or whatever, you got a good expression. And then you need probably changes from the business environment. One of our policy priorities is tweaking the apprenticeship levy, so there's more apprenticeship places for young people. I know you're doing that in your business already, but so I would come at it from the schools on the one hand and the businesses on the other hand.
Okay. I think we were already alluded to a number of challenges, but also funding has been touched on.
Yeah.
Can we just focus in on funding for a bit? To what element is funding really the fundamental challenge? Chris, if you could kick off.
Well, I'll be controversial and say the amount of money, well, we always make excuses, there isn't enough money, we can't give more money to schools, etc. Schools have to cut back, make savings, they're under massive cost pressures at the moment, which Lesley can talk about far better than I can. Sorry.
Thank you.
I think that the main issue with funding isn't so much that the lack of funding, is that we spend a huge amount on things which are just totally unproductive and don't hit the main buttons. The amount of waste within spending and the entire sort of government budget is absolutely enormous. I mean, anybody who knows anything about MOD procurement, they can't buy a boot, let alone a tank. They designed a tank at massive expense that damaged the soldiers inside it. You'd have been better off selling that tank to the enemy than developing the thing. That we wasted billions on that. The NHS spent £1 billion commissioning an IT system that then they ended up with no end product. So there's lots of money there. We need to massively cut the waste within the system and then focus on the things that matter. And I think with the NEETs, what tends to happen, I largely agree with what Irene said there, but we tend to look at the how do you put this, the front end of the pipe, or the end of the pipeline. So we look at them at 16 and think, what can we do? How can we intervene? And how do we change things? And I think we need to look at the other end of the pipeline, because as I said, most of these problems, by the time they're 2, if you haven't begun the interventions that are needed, then all of the problems that Lesley's talking about, the lack of resilience, putting it at the simplest level, they can't play together, they're having meltdowns about nothing. then these things are embedded, and they are fundamentally, I think, a result of the earliest years, how they've been brought up. And I don't mean that as an attack on parents, because if you don't know what you don't know, then you're not going to do it as a parent. I think these are issues that have been going on now and getting worse for quite some time. So it's not a COVID thing. But schools have been really, really good at papering over the cracks, getting kids to where they need to be, getting them onto the next stage of education. And then as they get older and the support reduces, then the cracks become wider. COVID massively accelerated those trends. Families went off a cliff edge. And when you get rid of programs like Sure Start, then the issues which begin at the earliest years then haunt children throughout their life. And when you look at speech and language, literacy in particular, the way that boys develop, and then when you look at those who are needs, when you look at the prison population, you really are looking at the fruits of what's been sown before they're 2 years old. And it's ironic because I think the research shows that if you intervene really well between, sort of before 2 and 2 to 4, that as long as you've got really, really strong primary schools and primary education after that, those benefits last almost throughout a child's life. So we have a fantastic primary schools. They do an amazing job, and we've got phenomenal secondaries as well. But the bit is in those very earliest years. So we need to turn off the tap of NEETs now, or as Lesley said, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse as we go through. And the funding that we have needs to be massively concentrated on a few key golden threads, and not just between 1 to 2 or 2 to 4, and then in primary school, but throughout the educational career of the young people that we identify in those particular circumstances. And then they will go into the world of work. A lot of the problems that Lesley will see, in secondary won't manifest in the numbers that they do or the severity that they do. We won't have to do this constant backfilling, and we've got this massive problem. How do we cope with it now? Stop the problem from becoming a massive problem in the first place, and then the pressure on the whole system will ease as well.
Chris, can I bring Irene in here in terms of funding? What's your perception here? Do you want to challenge back?
I think I agree with the point about funding not necessarily being spent in the right place. And I had the privilege of working with Naomi Eisenstadt, who was the mother of Sure Start. And clearly that budget has been significantly cut. I think it's a little too early to be writing people off at the age of 2, mind. So we take young people in at the age of 16 who have had significant trauma in their lives, and there's a lot of reasons why they've come out of school unencumbered by qualification. And we have put them through accountancy qualifications, law degrees. Prior to Thomas Cook, 43% of our senior managers started their careers as young people, many of whom who had a troubled existence. And I take the point about family and upbringing, but I think if the funding went into the helping those young people who need that most, and I'm absolutely with Lesley around emotional resilience, and again, worked with Martin Seligman, father of cognitive behavioural psychology, who did major pieces of work with in schools in Manchester, South Tyneside and Hertfordshire around transition-aged children. And the funding for that was significant, but it was evaluated by the London School of Economics, who went on to prove that if you funded emotional resilience and enabled young people to decatastrophize, I know that's a horrible word, but it worked. And all of the evaluation, which the Cabinet Office and the Young Foundation and various other people contributed to the outcomes of the cost of that. So I think that within the existing funding envelope, I'm not saying there's not pressures, but there's pressures everywhere in life. There's pressures in business. There's pressures in the NHS. It's about prioritising where we think we could have most impact, which would help the outcomes for those young people coming out of education. So I don't agree about 2 years old, I'm afraid, but I do agree that a lot of the funding, you know, is spent on certain aspects of the curriculum which are not necessarily going to ensure best outcomes for young people.
Before I turn to Nick, who really wants to come in here,
I'm going to disagree.
a pre-warning to the audience.
Yeah.
After Nick's response, I will come to the audience for some questions, so you can think your questions while Nick is.
Yeah, no, I was just going to disagree. I mean, I think I agree. Of course, there's different ways we can use some of the money, and there'll be some poor decisions amongst a lot of good decisions in how the money's spent. But I don't think we will shift the dial on opportunity in the UK without spending more. I just don't see it. When you look across, gaps in early years provision, you look at the erosion of the pupil premium, you look at student finance and how that's putting people off going to university. So I don't see how we're going to shift the needle without, spending, I don't know, another 10 to 20 billion, which would be 10 to 20% just on the education overall spending.
Yeah, that's again an argument I've heard for 40 years, that however much the funding is. So where are you going to get that from?
This is not Sutton Trust official policy, but I was just in the spirit of it. But I think you could raise that through taxation.
Yeah, I think we need to get in the queue behind the NHS on that one.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just turn to the audience? We've got a roving mic, so we've got a question over there. Just in your row up there. In the back. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi there. My question, it comes back, we've talked a lot about policy and a lot about what the government should do and funding and all the rest of it. And you've touched a little bit on about the parents, and I do think the kind of book stops there, in my opinion. My father was a miner. My mother was a cleaner. They left school at 14, but they had aspirations for their children beyond what they did, and they worked hard to make sure we did our homework. They made sure, even though they may not be able to help us with the homework, they made sure we did it, made sure that there was a fundamental understanding in, you didn't just get money as like pocket money, there was a direct relationship between work. You did the dishes, you cleaned the car, you did something and you got money. And they made sure I got access to education, even though they couldn't afford to fund it. They gave me the aspiration for something more. My career, I was a member of the British Diplomatic Service. I actually spent a lot of time helping British businesses export and do business overseas and helping big companies invest in the UK. And so my question comes back to, it's about the parents and about what more should be done to encourage parents to give the aspiration to their children, to help with the whole, you know what I mean? You say parents don't know what they don't know. So isn't there something that should be done to encourage parents to learn these things? My parents didn't know everything, but they had the aspiration for their children. And I think that relationship in terms of aspiration of parents to their children is starting to maybe break down in some ways. And there's not the aspiration for your children to do better than you.
Thank you. Lesley?
Yeah, I would agree. But I think it's a little bit, again, it's a bit wider than that, as it always is. I think to some extent it comes down to the confusion is what do governments want from schools? Because I'm not entirely sure now. I think most people who don't work in schools would be truly shocked at the level of social care and social work and child protection work that you would be shocked at the amount of work that falls on the shoulders of schools and the responsibilities that schools have in that sphere. And we're funded to educate, but we're always having laid upon us increasing responsibilities. And I'm not saying we don't have a key role in there, I would never say that. We are a key partner in that work. But I think you probably would be shocked in that work. And, you know, I can give you an example. One of our primary schools, 50% of the entrance to nursery were not dry. They had nappies, 50%. Now, what happened? And I'm not talking to the children with special needs. That's an entirely different situation. Because when I went to school, or, you know, my mother would have been mortified if I wasn't dry. We've lost that sense of responsibility. We're now talking about teaching children to brush teeth. So I think there is something around relationships between parents and schools, and it's manifesting in other ways as well. We are subject to, I can't even begin to describe to you in the last couple of years, where we might have had 5 complaints a year, we have 50. And 27 FOIs and 14 SARs. And if I paint a blue wall bluey green, I'll get 5 letters of complaint and an Ofsted letter. It has become really incredible, and there's a real break in the relationship with some parents. So I think there's a whole load of work to do around there. But then we've got to think about the lack of services for chaotic families, struggling and vulnerable families who do want the best for their children, but are not quite there, and they just need that little bit of extra support, and that has just completely disappeared. That propping up that would have helped get a family onto a better pathway for those who need it is also not there, and schools are trying desperately to do that. But then it muddies the waters and what our roles and responsibilities are, and they're starting to, some parents are starting to look at schools as being responsible for every, you know, I can't tell you how many times the abuse one of our staff, our heads will get because of something that happened on Saturday night on the field. You know, I didn't let your child go there. I am not responsible for what you are allowing your child to do, but you would be astonished at the vexatious comments, the complaints, the letters, and actual downright abuse that staff are being subjected to at the moment, which, you know, when you talk about funding, children are people, and they're people heavy in terms of working with children. We're never going to invent a computer that does what people do with children, and we wouldn't personally, we would never want to. Social interaction and dealing with other people, it's people heavy work, and we need to think really carefully, what are we expecting and wanting schools to do, and we need to finance them appropriately to do that. We are under intense pressure at the moment. The entire system works on the massive amounts of overtime and unpaid work that people who work in schools, teachers and other staff do, which is why we can't recruit and retain anybody. And then that's just an evolving crisis, because that's more work for people, less stability within the school, children particularly in disadvantaged circumstances. They require constancy. They don't need 23 new members of staff every September. They need somebody who's going to be with them through it. We had a child during COVID came in, and it always touched my heart, and he said to one of the DSL ladies, our pastoral leads, he just said, well, Miss, I knew you'd be here. I knew it. And you know, that emotional attachment for some children, the key emotional attachments are in school. But we need to decide, you know, we need to say, what are schools for? What are we wanting them to do? What are we funding them for? But we need a reset in the relationship between parents and schools. I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a second question down here. In the third row. Thank you.
Thank you. I would totally agree with what's been said about Sure Start, and like Chris, I'm a member of the North East Child Poverty Commission. But at the other end, and I'd be particularly interested in hearing Dame Irene say a bit more about this, is what's the responsibility on all of us and the institutions that we belong to. How do we get people ready? How do we take on apprenticeships? And I mean, one of the things about the North East is we have a lot of municipal, charitable, other partners who would see ourselves as not necessarily the private sector, who I think could learn an awful lot. I mean, Dame Irene's had the probably the rare privilege, Matthew's a privilege, of having, you know, a career in authorities and state organisations and in the private sector. But too often I go to things and I hear employers say, oh, you know, we've got jobs and no one's applying for them. What about the responsibility of all of us and the authorities that we belong to actually twist ourselves around a wee bit more and take on more apprenticeships and actually put more into schools and actually take on a whole system approach?
Okay. Could you paraphrase the second part of the question for me?
So basically, the key question is, what you, in your opinion, what else can be done in order to encourage companies, organizations to really engage with, for example, apprenticeships, but also generally taking ownership here?
Okay, I think there are lots of ways, and I think it's a really huge question. And I know we need to be brief here. I think the first thing to do is significant changes to the funding of apprenticeship schemes, primarily because 72% of the companies in the UK are small and medium enterprises, and they really cannot afford to have, you know, I've got 64 trainers who operate within an academy system which is Ofsted accredited in order to achieve the outstanding outcomes for young people that we achieve. Lots of people can't afford that. Therefore, we need to come up with a more collegiate system whereby small to medium enterprises can link into and be funded much more effectively for the delivery of the apprenticeship scheme. I think genuinely, if we were serious about it, if you look at the devolution deal which has just been agreed for this region, we have a fabulous opportunity with the private sector partnerships which are emerging to even encourage companies to give young people the opportunity around some sort of you do it and have to opt out rather than you have to opt in. Society as a whole needs to step up to the plate, which is what I think you're saying, but it should be the situation that companies are expected to do this and that they should be expected to report about it in their company accounts if they're required to do that. So yes, the environment's important and we have to write lots of information about the environment. I'm not belittling it. Do I think that young people are mildly more important to the future of the environment above other things? And should we not, as society, have a responsibility, irrespective of what sort of organisation that you have, to make sure that you play a really full part in the future of the lives of the young people in this country? And unless it's a situation where companies are measured not just on their corporate social responsibility and their contribution to charity, but the way in which they interact with these young people who have not had an opportunity, perhaps in their home lives or their school lives, to experience just what it's like to have a group of people who tell you you're doing things right for a change instead of doing things wrong. So it needs a fundamental change, and the whole point of devolution is that we take ownership in our own future. And if there was a loud enough voice, and mine's okay, and I do talk to the authority and say, we have the power within our hands right now. Right now, we've got a devolution deal. We should grasp that nettle, and we should make sure that the North East is differentiated around the way that it deals with its young people and gives them opportunities that they haven't perhaps had before they were 16 years old.
I'd just like to add a perspective from a kind of provider perspective. Universities, colleges provide apprenticeship programs. We are constantly in discussion. I think what's really interesting is when you look at the UCAS data, application data for degree apprenticeships, 40% of all applicants, at 450,000, look at the moment as wanting to go into apprenticeships. But actually vacancies or actual vacancies are only 13,000. So you've got interest, we've grown the interest amongst those that we thought wouldn't really, no one wants to go. So the demand from a student side is there, and possibly also driven by the parents. But actually, we haven't got the vacancies. So it comes back to that kind of element. And I think what's really interesting is we are often, as a provider, get the inquiries of saying, could you put on a degree apprenticeship for 100 apprentices, because that's what we need in the industry. But we could, but we need also the vacancies. And I think that's reality of creating those vacancies is the challenge part of it. But I come to the next question here. Can we just have the roving microphone down here? And then I'll come up to you. Yeah. Thank you.
First of all, it's a macro comment, and then secondly, a micro question. I agree with Irene, Dame Irene, to challenge where's that money going to come from, and add, a penny on income tax, you won't see a Labour government who, in the future, but to agree with Chris that there's a lot of duplication. And Sir Jim Mackey from a Sink Estate in Jarrow, who's the new head of the NHS, he's already started to remove duplication, and there's going to be some difficult choices that are going to be made. The micro question it was said in the opening remarks that the Labour Party was seeking to bring forward policies for all of our young children. And one of the barriers I find to opportunity in some group trusts and academies is the draconian disciplinary regimes that are imposed on individual children. And I would just ask, what hope could you give to children who are regularly sanctioned in North East schools for minor breaches of such straitjacket rules, and how can they be steered to a brighter future?
Thank you for that. Irene, I'm conscious that you need to leave. Do you want to respond at all to this, or shall we say thank you to you?
Again,
Yeah.
I have to, having worked within the education system, I think what gets measured gets done. And it's appalling, because very often they're measured on the wrong things, like 5 A to C's at GCSE makes somebody a well-rounded person. Well, it doesn't. So what we need to do is start measuring with greater effectiveness how many of our schools are imposing sanctions upon our young people and why. What gets measured gets done, in my opinion, but Lesley's probably... Can I just at this point say, I'm really grateful that you asked me along, and I'm just an Irene. I got the Dame because of my commitment to young people, but it wasn't me, it was all the people who have over the years worked with all of those young people and dedicated their lives to try and make the lives of those young people better. Thanks for asking me for tonight, and I'm really sorry I have to go. Thank you
so much. Thank you. Lesley.
I wouldn't begin to comment on other schools. You've got to be really careful what you read in the press. I would say that. I'm not going to comment on other schools. It is my view that certainly in our trust we run schools as I think a good parent. I like to think of it as firm but fair. It's trite, I know, but it's true. Actually, children do need boundaries. Actually, the vast majority of children are very grateful for boundaries because it makes them feel safe. And they come to school because they feel safe and secure and they can learn. And actually, I was talking to one of our heads quite recently, and she said to me, actually, the behaviour of children now is, for the vast majority, is probably better than it has ever been. But what we are seeing post-COVID is that on the extremes, it is more extreme. And we're seeing with knives and violence and things like that. So I take a view that we need a firm but fair approach. Children need to be given multiple chances and reasonable expectations. But that there has to be consequences for action. And I actually think we do children a huge disservice if we teach them there are no consequences to your actions, because they're going into a world where there are real consequences for your actions. So it's walking that line. But I always take the line, schools have to be safe and orderly places. We have to keep all of the children safe and all of the staff safe. And remember, we can't recruit and retain. And it's not fair to expect staff or other children to tolerate violence, aggression, and sadly some of our young people have some really intractable problems, and our ability to get a child to a psychiatrist, for example, is, I can't even think what it would take to do. It is really very difficult for our children. We co-sponsor an SAMH school actually, and actually the profound work that school does. Some children do just need a different environment. They need a smaller environment. Sometimes a huge school is just never going to be right for some children. So I think the sort of a plethora of environments is really important, because horses for courses sometimes, and the work certainly our SAMH school does is quite astonishing actually, and re-engaging children, getting them back into the world of education. The framework around the curriculum is more relaxed in there because they can be, but actually some real success stories and virtually no NEETs coming out of there. We work with Eastern College actually, so it's actually 14 to 18 really if they want it. So there's actually a 4-year pathway of engagement, and that's been really, really successful. Costs money, of course. It costs money. But the other thing I would say is when we pick up a lot of inadequate schools. When schools have got to that point and are out of control, make no mistake of how difficult it is to regain control. And the adults have to be in charge to keep the children safe. The adults have to be in charge. So do not underestimate what that takes. And often you will see a surge, perhaps in exclusion during that period, because you have to draw a line in the sand and say that is unacceptable. And if you're going to save the vast majority of the children in that school and the vast majority of the children who will come thereafter, there has to be lines in the sand which schools cannot tolerate. We can't ask people to go to work and be abused and attacked and things of that nature, and sadly it does happen. But these are the extremes, and I would go back to what that head said to me. The good news is, she says, and I hear it all over, the vast majority of children are as good as they've ever been. But we do have to think about, as a society, why are the extremes more extreme? What is going on around this area of children? What is it we need to do to re-engage them? And Irene is really passionate about that, to re-engage those children back in the world of school and back and back into a more positive outlook on life and a more positive approach to the future. How do we engage them that actually, if you do this, you're going to be successful? And actually, I'll say one final thing. This is, it's really funny. Children need to feel they're going to be successful at something. So even if they're not great at maths and English, you have to have something going on in school that they're really good at or they really enjoy. You've got to think about, what are the pull factors of school? Ofsted used to have a phrase, maybe it's 2 frameworks ago, but it's always stuck with me. It talked about rich and memorable experiences. What are rich and memorable experiences these children have? And that really sticks with me. And I always ask, what are our rich and memorable experiences? What fun are we having? They're children. They are children. They've got to be able to have giggles and laughs and fun and engage in what is it that we're doing that means I'm not going to school today because I might miss that. So one of the things post-COVID we've been doing is what is it they don't want to miss? Come hell or high water, they're going to be in for that sort of thing. So it's thinking about that, the pull factors as well as the push factors that are pushing children out. It's hard to comment on other. Sorry, I'm not used to a microphone. It's really hard to comment on other schools, and I really wouldn't do so. You do have to be careful what you read, and I'm not saying everybody gets it right all the time. Schools, led by human beings, we're all. We do our best, sort of thing. The vast majority of people are doing their best in really tough circumstances, is what I would say.
Thank you, Lesley. And I think when you were talking about success, it reminded me when I took a group of Chinese head teachers to your school, and the students were starting playing table tennis and beated head teachers in table tennis, how proud they were. But no, can I ask you to just, they've got a question up there in the first row.
Thank you. So a question to all the panellists, please. So obviously Labour's just introduced VAT on private school places. Just wondering if you agree on this and looking at its actual impact on state education as well as private education, because obviously with the increased pressure on state education, how state schools could cope with that and whether or not it would be beneficial policy or not in your opinion.
Nick, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I should say the Sutton Trust, we don't have a position one way or the other on it. I think the evidence is mixed at the minute. I think we actually haven't seen that many young people leaving private school because of the VAT thing, and therefore the kind of predictions from there was a range of predictions out there from everyone from the Independent Schools Council to the IFS. I think what we've seen so far is the numbers leaving it towards the low end of what those predictions showed, and therefore the impact on the state schools is, I think, for now, relatively modest. I mean, obviously that might change over time.
Yeah.
To be honest, it's not something I've given a huge amount of thought to. When I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm worried about the buildings that are falling down in the schools that I've got. And I do sometimes muse how in a country of this degree of wealth we can provide a building that's not falling down for our children. They're the things I muse about at 3 o'clock in the morning. But I'll be honest with you, I haven't given it a great deal of thought. It's certainly not affecting or impacting on the intake to any of our schools.
Yeah, I'd largely agree with that. I mean, in terms of not giving it a lot of thought, I think there wasn't a lot of thought went into the policy, as in, what was the evidence base behind it, what were you going to raise and where we could spend that. So I don't think it's been a particularly well thought out one. There is a principle there as well that, you know, you're taxing education. Well, what about sports clubs? They're charities and, you know, partly educational. You know, do you hit them with that as well because you want to raise funds? But the main thing for kind of from a North East point of view was just of all of the issues that are faced in the North East and young people in schools within the North East. If you could have picked something which is as far down the list as possible, that was probably it. You know, it's not going to fix the SEND system in the North East. We're really struggling in terms of recruitment and retention. You know, the huge issues facing our schools and our communities, none of which are going to be alleviated by that policy. And, you know, what we really wanted to see was, you know, what's your vision for the whole system? How's that going to play out? What are you going to do to reform funding? And, you know, so to me it was just a bit of a, well, what's the point? It's not really relevant to the debate. So it remains to be seen kind of how it works out in terms of raising money. That money was going to be spent on recruiting 6,500 teachers. That's morphed quite considerably, that policy, since it was first announced. So I think it's now 6,500 teachers, possibly including retained teachers over the course of this Parliament. So we'll see what happens with it, but I don't think it's going to make any difference to the fundamental issues we're facing in the North East.
I think there's maybe one just point to add, I think is a sort of element of this debate is, you know, obviously it is a challenge for the private schools in terms of the fees going up by 20%, but equally, if you look at the data, private schools have inflated fees above inflation massively through their own choices over the last 20 years. So, you know, you have to sort of look at that in terms of why the fees are so high, right? It's partly the VAT that's just been added on top, but it's also partly what the schools themselves have chosen to do over the last 15, 20 years.
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the corner there, and then we go back there.
Thank you. Sorry, frog in my throat. I'm going to look at my phone. I've been making notes on my phone, so I'm not being rude. I'm just trying to pick up on some of the things that came up before. I work here at Newcastle University, and I'm directly involved in student recruitment and admissions here at the university, and widening participation and fair access and working with our local schools is a big part of what we do. So it's really great to see some of the school leaders here, and I'm going to come to you with a specific question that may help me in my future roles at some point. But first of all, I completely agree with what's said about the funding is not coming anytime soon, which is what we all need to put this right. I don't really want to sit around waiting for it to happen, especially with 2 children going through the state school education system in the North East at the moment. I can see the challenges firsthand with what's happening there. I totally agree as well around resilience and personal skills being the biggest issue for our young people in terms of progression. If our young people, regardless of background, have resilience and have the ability to talk to people, learning flows from that regardless what age you are and what walk of life and what background you're from. And that's what they're missing with these social media platforms, phones. They have lost the ability to interact, and I see it in my 2, and that's with me actually pulling the phones off them as well. I'm still failing, you know, so I really feel quite strongly about that. We also see that coming through in the university students, if I'm honest, and it's not just from students from underrepresented backgrounds either. It's from affluent, wealthy, independent, boarding school backgrounds. They've lost that ability to interact with people. They've lost that resilience. They're used to getting everything their own way, and they have a new sense of entitlement. The entitlement and the sense of what that is changes according to background. But every single student, regardless of background, comes in with a sense of entitlement that I would never have walked into an employment place with. I would have been grateful for a job and would have worked hard to actually do well at it. So that worries me. So I think what we're all saying when I'm listening to it is that this is a problem nationwide. We have more unique problems in the North East, which is around still a lack of an awareness about employment opportunities, even those in the North East, and how to get there, what the progression routes are to get there. But we have a bigger problem with attainment in secondary school that the rest of the country doesn't have to the same extent. And this confuses me because our primary schools are excellent and they always come up above average. So I'm like, oh, that's our same children going through primary school and then progressing to secondary school regardless of their backgrounds. So I'm not quite sure what's happening there, and I think that I would like somebody to help me understand that a bit better, because they're the schools that we're engaging with. But I think going back to what we're all agreement on is that young people post-COVID, their needs and their barriers to success have changed. We've got different young people coming through the education system to young people when I did, and what my needs and skills and gaps to my awareness were. And I'm not quite sure that education system is changing with it. And I think that in a way we're trying to bridge the academic gap still, but we're not bridging the other gaps that we're seeing emerging in our young people that are absolutely critical to success in any walk of life. So I think, and this is not a question for all of you, potentially for anybody who's in a position senior enough to lobby the government, I do my best in terms of HE policy when I can, but not for anything else. But is the answer a change in the requirement or priorities for schools and for universities from our regulators? I still want Ofsted and OFS to join up. They work in isolation. There is no point. We're still part of the same education system. And what your barriers to progression should be going into employment should be the same for universities to work on. But do we need to broaden that out so that actually, rather than being focused on 9 GCSEs, grade A to C, that actually they only have 4 or 5, but that they do then still have educational experience, employment experience, a wealth of personal skills that are measured and assessed in a way that makes progression far more easier and makes them more successful young people coming out the other end. So a long question, but I think I'm fully in agreement. And as I think you can probably tell, I'm really passionate about this too. So would very welcome a discussion afterwards
Thank
too.
You, Emma. Who would like to? Nick first and then...
Yeah, I can go. I think a couple of answers. I think you're sort of putting your finger on the heart of the question there in some regards. I think on the northeast schools, I think one important point we haven't discussed yet, and I want to make is schools in the northeast are some of the most segregated in the country at secondary school. So that is one hypothesis as to why it goes from, as you said, from primary to secondary. And by that, what I mean is, when you look at the data of, we did a report last year which looked at all secondary schools in the country, and what you find is the best secondary schools the best state schools in the country have fewer free school meal kids attending them than live in their locality. And what you get in some areas is you have some schools with not very many free school meal kids and some schools with lots of free school meal kids. And that's what we mean by segregation. And the northeast is one of the worst areas in the country for that segregation and that polarization between schools with lots of disadvantage and schools with not much disadvantage. One of the big drivers of that, by the way, is faith schools. So that is a hypothesis as to why you see that effect in the northeast. That, I think, can be changed through regulation. One of our policy priorities is to require oversubscribed schools to somehow give priority to disadvantaged kids, at least up until the mix of their local area. So that is one way to address that. Then again, on your HE thing, again, I think there is partly a regulatory answer to that as well. And again, when you look at university access across the last 25 years, the story is lots more kids are going to university, but the gap in access between advantaged and disadvantaged has hardly closed, right? And again, if I was the minister, I'd be saying to the HE sector, I want to see a plan that can close at least, let's say, half of that gap over the next decade, and I would want to set targets for the sector to kind of move towards that. Not in a hard-edged way, I don't think. I don't think they've... They prevent us from charging higher fees that we don't meet those targets. No, I know, but I think the challenge with that, I think, is that's such a that's such a nuclear option. OFS will never apply that to universities, so in a way they haven't got a sanction. And also, I don't think they've set strong enough targets. I don't think they've said to the sector, the gap. There's a 20-point gap between advantage and disadvantage today. I disagree. You do. Yeah, no, this is a good debate, right? Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely, they can't, yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, it's largely too late by the time you get to university if you talk about closing gaps. And I don't mean you can't continue to close gaps throughout life, but if you're going to send somebody to university at 18, you're not going to close the gap overnight, or you're not going to close it by 21. I mean, there's a huge amount of unpicking what you've said. I don't really know what, in the question, I don't know where kind of to start. If we start with, you know, essentially what's happening in North East secondaries, I think was one of the things you said there. Well, I think it would be very unfair to say that North East secondaries are worse than secondaries elsewhere. I mean, we hear a lot about the North-South gap in education, or North-South divide in education, and it's really interesting when you ask people, what is the North? And about as technical as they can get is to say it's not the South, and if you ask them, what's the South? Well, it's not the North, is it? And that's great, and I've seen some maps where they've drawn the divide, and they go down to Bristol, and then no map I've ever looked at is Bristol in the North. You get this diagonal line, it's just completely arbitrary. You know, what you get at secondary is a much greater concentration of the of children who have been in long-term deprivation for the longest. So when you compare certain secondaries in the North East with, say, secondaries in other parts of the country, you're not comparing apples with apples. And it would literally be, I don't know, you've got a 100-metre race, somebody starts 150 metres away from the line, finishes last, and then you say, oh, they're useless, aren't they? They're really slow, because they came last in the race. Well, they started much further behind. And when you look at different measures of secondary performance, then there is quite a transformational impact in terms of where North East secondaries are in the league tables. The Northern Powerhouse Partnership has their Fairer Schools Index, and it's very interesting to see what happens. I think one of Lesley schools is right at the very top of that league nationally. But all North East schools go up that league dramatically compared to the one that arbitrarily the DFE currently use. And it's interesting, Tim Lunig, who used to be the chief scientist at the DFE, and we got him, he was the brains behind Progress 8, and he was quite honest when he came up and he spoke to, I think, just about every secondary in the North East. It's quite a while ago now, and he said we forgot to include we forgot to include long-term deprivation, and it's really sorry, that was a big mistake, and he admitted that therefore that you were getting the wrong readings essentially from the measurements that they were using. You know, the structure of education is very different in the North East compared to, say, London. You know, I remember talking to one very experienced secondary head, very, very successful secondary head, who's retired now in the North East. And she would talk about how many students, this is well before COVID, how many students in London got private tuition compared to the number of students in the North East, and that makes a massive difference. And it's interesting, even some affluent catchment areas in the North East, when you talk to the heads about the performance of the school and the staff, they'll often say, I've got a real issue here. I've got an affluent catchment area, a lot of the kids are getting private tuitions. When I'm looking at how good my staff are, how do I disaggregate the impact of the tutor and the staff to see are my staff good or otherwise? You know, so largely the debate has been a really negative one. There was a report out by EPI, I think it was a couple of months ago, which looked at head teachers across the country. The North East secondaries have a disproportionately high number of outstanding leaders and produce internally a disproportionate number of outstanding leaders than any other area in the country. And that there are lots of other reports that when you dig under the hood, you know, show the tremendous job that our secondaries do. But it's a very, very tough job. And if you then pick, you know, as Irene said, a fairly arbitrary measure of 5 A star C in old money, and just measure them against that, then you won't get a nuanced understanding of what's going on.
Can I just bring Lesley in the response?
Given we serve schools in challenging circumstances, you think I'd be a big fan of Progress, but I'm really not. Because I think there's hard currency privilege and there's soft currency privilege. Children who have soft currency privilege, who will always have somebody behind them who can get them into there or do that or whatever, it doesn't really matter what they get in their GCSEs. It's not as important. They'll get another shot, they'll get another opportunity, or they'll find another way, or their family will around them. So I'm going to say to you, it's not either or, it's both. We have to educate the whole child holistically and prepare them for life, and that's critical, as well as give them the academic excellence. So I'm unashamedly academic for those children for whom it's proud. We need more flexibility for those children, and we don't want to undo all the Wolf reforms, because some of those qualifications were truly terrible, you know, but we do need more flexibility for those children who need a more vocational, more hands-on approach. There's no question around that. And I think for those children who are having to resit post-16, that needs a better solution. There is no question around that. But I am unashamedly of the view that unless the children we are serving, we equip them with those qualifications at that first chance, they're probably not going to get another chance, and they don't have families who can make that up for them. So what's the difference between our children and the children who are perhaps at Durham School? How do I get them into a position where not only have they got the academic qualifications, but actually in an interview they can come across in a way, because, you know, first bite is with the eye, and maybe how can they present themselves? So I completely agree. The soft skills, the oracy, the presentation, the confidence, isn't it? A lot of it's confidence. You know, once you've got the confidence to fail, you'll succeed. You know, the children have to be. Some of our children, particularly boys, would rather not try than fail, than lose face. Losing face is the worst thing that can happen to them, not being successful. So when you start to turn a school and you get that success coming through and they see it, it is truly amazing the impact that has on other children, and they start to believe that actually if I do what I'm told, if I do this, I am going to be successful. That belief and that confidence is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I believe that you have to have both things, because, you know, some children will be fine anyway because of the families they're born into and the support around them and the financial support, all the rest of it. We know that. But for the bulk of the children we serve, and again, you know, if they are Oxbridge medics, they should have their chance. If they're apprentice engineers, they should have their chance. If they are brilliant technicians or, you know, or instrumentalists or whatever, they should have their chance, no matter the family they were born into. So I completely agree that it's not the only thing that matters, but it does matter. Yeah.
Sorry, Emma, I need to stop you because I've got one more person who wanted to come in at the top there.
Hi everyone. It's more an observation than a question, but it's what effect is social media having on the younger generation nowadays? Does everyone want to be an influencer rather than, you know, go into an apprenticeship or into employment? I think it's a bad thing, personally. I think we need to hit a reset button somewhere along the line and take a reality check.
It is the work of the devil. I actually mean that. It is the work of the devil. It is severely damaging our children. It's severely damaging our staff. The amount of abuse they're subjected to. I think it is a really poorly regulated thing. I have a 6-month-old grandson, and one of the things I've said to my daughter and my son-in-law, who are very IT literate, is whatever you do, keep them away from iPads and phones for as long as humanly possible. Keep them away from it as long as humanly. I think we are doing significant damage to our children, and I do turn into Mary Whitehouse a little bit about this, and some of the things that children are accessing on phones is damaging them and damaging society as a result, and nobody seems to care. Is how it feels to me. And I feel maybe that's making me sound very old, but that's how I feel. Nobody seems to care enough to do anything about it, that's for sure.
You said earlier on, Lesley, about reconnecting with education. I think that's where we need to hit that reset button.
Yeah. It's funny, about maybe 12 years ago, I used to be the head of Sutton Hall, and I walked out and I was stood, and at that point, so about 12 years ago, I was a great believer that we have to teach children to use their technology responsibly, and that was my view. And I remember standing in the atrium area at break time, looking around, quiet kids, all of them looking at their screens. And I said to the deputy head, that's it, phones are going. And he was going, oh, there'll be hell on. And I said, I don't care, they're going. I'm wrong. It's not about teaching them to use them responsibly. They're not talking to each other. And to be honest, actually it took 2 or 3 days and they were gone. But they do adapt. because they're amazingly resilient children when it comes to it. They do adapt. But so when you first bring that rule in, and it was a long time ago then, but there is a bit of backwash, but it quickly it dies away very, very quickly, and the new normal is established. But I remember it was a long time ago now. I'm guessing 12 years. It was a long time ago, but I remember thinking, I'm not taking this seriously enough, and that change had to be made. So telling them not to bring them to school, you're never going to win on that. Often in their bags. That if we see them, then you lose it. But often in your bag, and then that I think is the sensible way. If you get into locking them away, and that is a world of madness, and it's going to just absorb lots of time and energy. So, couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you for this question, and it's not just this country; it's obviously a global phenomenon. And some people may have seen in the Austrian, where I'm originally from, in the Austrian coalition discussions in the last few weeks, it has been agreed that schools would be banned, phones would be banned in schools from next academic year. Panel members, we are to the final question, and the final question is, if you had a magic wand, what one new policy would you bring in tomorrow to improve access to education and employment in the North East? Chris? Keep it short, because we've got only...
Right, I'll keep it really short. You crack the earliest years, so you fix that initial period, speech, language, emotional regulation, so they can actually participate as fully formed human beings in some respect. But then they can gain success at nursery, success at primary school. And if you get that right with the primary schools that we've got and the secondary schools that we've got, there would be a transformative effect on the school system, is my opinion. But linked to that is also what you do with the parents, because that is a massive piece that again is missing from the system at the moment. They participate in the sense that they're involved in it, but how we help them to help the system is virtually non-existent at the moment. And I think the gentleman's question about social media, that the parents will be on social media as well. So they could spend all the time on social media and never interact with the child. And you can ask them, are you a good mother? Do you care about your child? Etc. And you get yes all the way down the line. There's no understanding of kind of the impact of what they're doing. And if you crack that whole piece around parenting in the earliest years, then there would be a transformative impact on the school system.
I would agree with everything, and I could write a really long list. If I had to pick one thing, just as we see now, I lived and worked in Manchester for 14 years as a teacher, and I studied in London. And one of the things I think the North East suffers from is being small. And that mix of ideas and mix of people is more restricted. And I noticed very much when I came back from the Northwest, the different ideas. Some schools in the North East do buck the trend, even with their disadvantaged children who are performing as well as all children. Some of our schools are in that position. So it is possible to do it, but I think we suffer from being relatively geographically isolated, and therefore the school community is relatively small. And this is not the fix-all, it's just one thing, but actually looking outside would help for us, I think, taking a wider view of what can be achieved. Because I think sometimes expectations, it's not just the children, it's the adults as well. They need to expect more for themselves and for their children. Yeah.
Thank you, Lesley. And Nick?
Yeah, I think one thing I would go much harder on economic regeneration, and that means investment in the region in things like, science, research. Why aren't we building the UK's AI centre in Newcastle or whatever? Yeah? And that I think is the thing which ultimately will catalyse everything else in the region. So that's where I would go first, if I could, in my treasury magic wand of billions or whatever. That's where I would go.
We'll have a conversation after the spending review.
Yes, there won't be the billions. Yeah.
May I say thank you to the panellists, but also you as an audience for being so engaging and asking such challenging and occasionally long questions. Before I say thank you to the panel and read out their names again, can I just remind you that the next debate is on Thursday, the 1st of May, on economic empowerment. How can we drive growth in the North East? And can you now join me of thanking Chris, Lesley, Nick, and obviously also Dame Irene. Thank you very much.